Over to you, sir. Chair.
Chair, are you here?
Yeah, I can.
Yes, sir, please start.
Yeah, thank you very much. So should I take the responsibility of the session now?
Absolutely, sir.
Okay, thank you. First of all, I offer my sincere thanks to Dr. Pramod Jaiswal and NICE for this wonderful opportunity for collaborating with our department. We are from Department of Gandhian and Peace Studies, Mahatma Gandhi Center University, Bihar, India, and we are never to Nepal, very close to Nepal, that place, and this collaboration was done with the interest and dynamic leadership of our head of the department, Professor Sunil Mahavar. So I am also thankful to him to get engaged with NICE in this wonderful event. And equally, I'm highly thankful to Dr. Pramod Jaiswal for providing us the opportunity to work together and for this joint conference. So we are partnering in this. And since in the introduction, we have seen that lot of scholar of the world, those has been speaking, already spoken in this nice events earlier, and we have seen that Professor Chomsky and Stephen Wald, Mir Shammer, the IR student, or because our panel is consisting some research students also, that these scholars you might have been read in your IR books. So it is a wonderful opportunity for all of you to engage with NICE, and in the future runs that you can be more engaged, and we will have a future plan for that matter, that since the place is not very far, so that we can have whenever this pandemic is coming down, so we can have some physical movements over there, and we can work some constructive kind of research and other kind of the development things. So thank you very much once again. In this session, we are having 7 or 8 panelists we have, and since this session is on peace and security in South Asia, so when we are talking of South Asia, then automatically South Asia is a region that has been least peaceful and most debating regions in the world. Some full-scale interstate wars and number of other low-intensity armed conflict, ethnic conflict, secessionist movement, terrorism that have mounted a challenge to the peace in the region. And instability in the region is further strengthened by the troubled relations between the neighboring countries like India and Pakistan, and internal conflicts in Pakistan and Afghanistan. Recently, we have seen that the situation in Afghanistan is affecting whole South Asia, and all the countries of the region are worried about what will be the future challenge, the kind of the regime that is taking place in Afghanistan, with the support of Western powers, with some criticism. But it will be very interesting to see what will be the future of the security in South Asia, and all of the countries of the region and the extended region. They are worried about the security because of the radical behavior of the past regime. And if we talk of Indo-Pakistan rivalry, the Kashmir conflict is a major problem that has a potential to destabilize the entire South Asian region, and such a widespread threat to peace. Because we have seen, if we talk of Sri Lanka, then there was a civil war there. If we are talking of Nepal, there is a problem of governance, and from monarchy to constitutionalism. So many problems in Bangladesh also. These were some incident of the ethnic conflict and secessionist movement in like Maoist and other kind of the left-wing extremism in India. So these things are challenging. And on the other end, apart from this uh, traditional security things, then we are also having a kind of problems of poverty, unemployment. And so these are also a big challenge for peace and stability in South Asia. So since we have been allotted almost 2 hours for this session, and we are having 7 or 8 speakers in this session. So I would like to invite Jugnu Ara. She is going to speak on. She is a research scholar in the Department of Peace, Gandhian and Peace Studies, Mahatma Gandhi Central University, and she is going to speak on water dispute in South Asia, challenges to peace and security. Now over to you, Jugnu. Are you there? Jugnu Ara? Jugnu Ara? Jugnu Ara, are you there?
Sir, we do not have.
So we think that she's not here, so you may proceed with the next speaker, and as soon as she joins in, you can have her towards the end.
Then I would like to invite Nilesh Anand. Nilesh, you are there? Nilesh?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay, so Nilesh is also a research scholar in the Department of Gandhian and Peace Studies, Mahatma Gandhi Central University, Bihar, and he is going to speak on great power politics in Afghanistan, implications for regional peace and security. So Nilesh, your topic is very interesting. So we need to know some current development in your presentation in terms of Afghanistan. Thank you very much. So now over to you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Nice, for giving us this opportunity, and thank you, sir, for providing us this wonderful opportunity. Good afternoon, everyone. Myself, Nilesh Anand, I'm a research scholar from Mahatma Gandhi Central University of Bihar. Today, I'm going to present topic Great Power Politics. Great power politics in Afghanistan, implication for regional peace and security. Afghanistan, in the late 19th century, Lord George Curzon observed that Afghanistan was at its origin an empty space on map which was neither Persian, Russian nor British. To this day, despite the objection of many Afghan scholars, many consider Afghanistan as a regional country. Little more than geopolitical compression zone at the intersectional point of the regional security architectures of Russia, Iran, and India. Indeed, it is one of the few countries in the world whose fate is so intertwined with the action, interaction, and reaction of its neighbor that it can barely be said to have any independence of its own. United States Secretary of State Antony Blinken's letter to Afghanistan President Ashraf Ghani, leaked to the press in March 2021, set forth a spate of diplomatic statement as Joe Biden government had clarified their stance on ending the war on Afghanistan. The long-running Doha process, where much headway has been made since 2013 between the Afghanistan government and others, new forums in Russia and Turkey are taking place to take the conversation further, and more regional international actors are getting involved. The political vacuum created by the withdrawal of NATO and US forces from Afghanistan has led other powers to attempt to fill the void for the region of regional stability and create and extend their sphere of influence. So my study will be divided into three sections. We'll try to discuss how great power across the world has tried to utilize Afghanistan for maintaining their hegemony. And the first topic is Afghanistan and its history before 1911. Afghanistan, known as a graveyard of superpower, as most of them had to face defeat. A few have invaded Afghanistan, like Alexander, Arab kings, Genghis Khan, Shahjahan, Aurangzeb, Raja Ranjit Singh. In 19th century, Afghanistan was the buffer zone between Russia and the British occupied India. British and Afghan for three Anglo wars, and the first two Anglo wars, British has to face the defeat. But in the third Anglo-Afghan wars, this was known as War of Independence. On August 9, 1919, British recognized Afghanistan. August 1919, British recognized Afghanistan as constitutional monarchy under King Amanullah Khan. He was a liberal man, broke the polygamy rule by marrying only one queen, Surya Tarji, who brought progressive reforms like school for girls, equal rights for women, right to divorce, etc. But in 1928-29, religious fundamentalists stood up against them, and the king and the queen had to take asylum somewhere else. In 1933, Zahir Shah came and ruled for next 40 years, modernizing Afghanistan. In 1964, he gave voting rights and further banned royal family on any governmental post, and thus giving birth to two ideologies: communist, known as the PDPA, and the Islamist fundamentalist, known as Mujahideen. The Mujahideen was funded by USA, and communists were funded by USSR. So Mujahideen has killed 2 or 3 leaders of communists, and so in 1979, USSR entered Afghanistan to fight against Islamist Mujahideen. USA gave funding to Hizbul Mujahideen. Later, Soviet Union got Hafizullah killed, and Barack Karmal came in power. Since USA was big here, America, CIA, Pakistan, ISII, British M16, and Saudi Arabia were supporting and funding Mujahideen. USSR left Afghanistan in 1989. Dr. Muhammad Najibullah was in power in 1990. He declared Afghanistan as Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. In 1992, Mujahideen won the civil war against Najibullah, and Burhanuddin Rawani came to power. But in 1996, a group of people removed him, known as Taliban, under the leadership of Mullah Omar. They were more extreme than Mujahideen, believed in Pashtun nationalism. Earlier, people supported Taliban in hope for peace, but they showed their true color by banning TV, cinema, music, football, education for girls above 10 years. Ethnic cleansing began against non-Pashtun. But in 2001, a few incidents changed the government in Afghanistan again, and Hamid Karzai chosen as head of Afghanistan. Afghanistan, Taliban, US, and 9/11. In the aftermath of 9/11, US and China engagement in Afghanistan has portrayed competitive underpinning manifested in the matrix of great power politics. Viewed under new structure realism and complex interdependence perspective, Sino-US interests have struggled on convergence and divergence, portraying the desire to subdue the other players in Afghanistan. Sino-US competitive balancing has unleashed vast implications for South Asian regional security and stability. Broadly speaking, Sino-US interests converge on stability, but the problem lies in defining stability. My focus here is to explore the US and Chinese engagement in Afghanistan from 9/11 to 2021 by employing new structure and complex interdependence paradigm. I argue that Sino-US rivalry holds negative imprint for stability in region by inducing polarization. The US-Chinese competition have worsened South Asia state relations. Moreover, Sino-US competition has darkened the prospect of South Asian economic cohesion and interconnectivity, which is a prerequisite to restoring stability in Afghanistan and the entire region. With this background, I have divided this section in 2 sections: US security objectives in Afghanistan and China security interest in Afghanistan. So first, we will see US security objectives. The US realist balancing in Afghanistan originates from South Asia's increasing in significance as the hub of global interconnectivity due to Belt and Road Initiative and its flagship project, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, CPEC, in the post-9/11 era. Washington objective in Kabul holds geostrategic underpinning for China and Southwest Asia. Painted in the backdrop of offensive-defensive realistic balancing, the US-China portray divergence of the interest at all 3 levels. Strategically, the US military presence in and around Afghanistan, which is close to China's doorstep, has urged Beijing. Politically, Washington's intention of portraying a larger Indian role in Afghanistan affairs has conflicted with China's aspiration to expand its influence in South Asia. Economically, America's interests have competed with China's desire to have access to mineral resources in Afghanistan, like uranium. 40 years of troubled history speaks volume about Afghanistan's unfortunate geostrategic profile, making it a quagmire of great power rivalry. However, the US plan for physical control of Afghanistan, cooked up earlier than the attack on Twin Towers in New York, block of American plan of pipeline construction from Central Asian oil reserves by Taliban, Washington twisted relations with Taliban and Iran, impaired all the prospect for oil transportation from the Caspian Sea into Central Asia. The US-Taliban talks, however, broke off in July 2001, and within the next 60 days, the US launched Operation Enduring Freedom. China's security interest. New structural paradigm throws light on the broad parameters of China policy interest in Afghanistan in the competing era. Power and maximization of security have assured Beijing of maintaining its major country status. China's policy interest in Afghanistan has been primarily set up by internal compulsion, the grand vision of strategic opportunity 2025. BRI, along with the old historic route, is an important manifestation of China's vision of great power status. China expansion of interest is manifested in stabilizing its first military base in Afghanistan, yet the Chinese government denied this claim, asserting that its military involvement remains restricted respect to stabilizing Afghan capacity, building military training and material equipment to finance and train the Afghan brigade. On the political side, since 2001, China has been providing huge reconstruction and development assistance with successive episodes of additional grant for development of Badakhshan province in Afghanistan, intelligence sharing for border security and law enforcement, loan exemption, etc. On the economic side, China holds a huge interest in resources extraction in Afghanistan. It has emerged as the second largest recipient of Afghan raw materials exports, whereas Kabul has emerged as the principal recipients of Beijing huge financial grants. Post-US war and the Taliban. Today, the ghost of the great game as the 19th century political confrontation between the British Empire and the Russian Khajar, vying for influence over Central and South Asia, was known as present with the largest set of regional players. From China to Turkey, the race for influence in Afghanistan is underway. Taliban's upraised in Afghanistan, Afghan civil war has sent refugees flooding across the border between the nations, along with rise in drug and human trafficking and terrorist activity. The USA war in Afghanistan is over after 20 years, and Taliban has captured almost all provinces of Afghanistan. This war had become a virtual shrine for the follies of American interventionism, the internal complexities of Afghan politics, and the regional wrangling over parochial interest in South Asia. From the beginning of the conflict, in the aftermath of 9/11 and the start of America's war on terror campaign, the Afghan war moved towards an ad hoc plan. The narrative that it carried it toward of defeating Al-Qaeda, demonizing Taliban, and institutionalizing democratic political system in Kabul have made with limited success. India stand on Taliban. Throughout the international negotiation process with Taliban, India has mostly been an outlier, refusing to join the table and preferring to back the democratic process and government in Taliban. New Delhi support in Afghanistan is largely taking the form of institutions, from building dams and supporting education to training members of Afghanistan military and providing them equipment and training in policing and diplomacy. One sources report India has already invested close to $3 billion in reconstruction activities in the country. Pakistan, Taliban, and the love affairs continues. Pakistan will neither let go of the Taliban nor change its strategy on Afghanistan, of which Taliban are a linchpin. Pakistan will not be averse to temporary Taliban government place because they see it as a paving the way for longer-term political solution, and more as they feel that once Taliban get absolute power in Kabul, it will only be a matter of time before they can run their propaganda along with China and control that region. For Pakistan, there is no downside up to their support for Taliban. Over the years, the US has done nothing more than urging Pakistan to do more. There has been neither significant economic sanction nor coercive diplomacy to force Pakistan to give up Taliban options. Over the years, Pakistan has developed a significant leverage over the Taliban, which it thinks will help it exercise a fair bit of control in Islamic Emirate. Turkey and Iran. Turkey, although it does not share a border with Afghanistan, and despite stern warnings from the Taliban, has decided to protect the international airport in Kabul, even at the cost of risking the safety of its own security personnel. There is a less than altruistic reason for that discussion, and an analyst states Turkey stand up to benefit from the protection of the airport and overall stability in Afghanistan, but perhaps it is importance of the geostrategic web crease crossing Afghanistan that has led Turkey to remain involved, be seeking to exploit any potential opportunities to engage with regional stakeholders such as Pakistan, Iran, Russia, and China. Iran approach to Afghanistan is too prolonged, one that is regional in nature, and second that is the context of Iran fractured relation with USA. Dragon and dreams. The impending US withdrawal from Afghanistan, the so-called heart of Asia, presents China with an opportunity to extend its influence in a country of such strategic importance. Beijing's approach toward Taliban forces will be calibrated by factors including its own geopolitical ambition. China envoyed to Afghanistan Wang Wu assured that as their most trustworthy neighbor, China looks forward to the realization of stability, reconstruction, and development in Afghanistan. Ties between Taliban and Chinese Communist Party have grown up. Its intention to play an important role in Afghanistan after American withdrawal has given them two opportunities. First, incentivizing military cooperation. The eventuality of US to withdrawal from the territory could defend military cooperation between China and Afghanistan. Getting such a toll in a strategic region that borders West Asia and Central Asia will help China base its hard power projection beyond its border. Changing narrative on Muslims. China's human rights record has come under increasing scrutiny for its policy in Xinjiang. Former US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has accused China of carrying out a genocide against the Muslim Uyghurs in the region. China is certainly trying to shape opinion in the Muslim world. One road, one belt is rooted through Central Asia and depends on sustained stability in Afghanistan. China's move in Afghanistan will be carefully examined by international community, and therefore they present both a challenge and opportunity. After all, one of the hallmarks of a great power is that it is able to mediate in geopolitical disputes of third country. The very great fact here is each and every great powers, each and every country, either it's India, Pakistan, China, Iran, each and everyone, they are seeing they are seeing their benefits. They are not looking for the stability or the peace process in Afghanistan. And the Taliban, we have seen what they are doing. USA, what they have done in Afghanistan, and the Russia, what they have done in Afghanistan. And now the time has come for China to show the world what they can see, what they can do in Afghanistan. And the whole world is seeing China. And the fact is, there is no peace. We can't achieve peace. Peace is very abstract. Each and everyone is running for peace. But as realist thinker says, international relation is anarchic. There is no great superpower which will go for others' benefit. They just try to maximize their powers. Thanks everyone. Thanks everyone for giving me this opportunity. Any question?
Thank you, Nilesh, for the wonderful presentation. You cover all the aspects, right, from the history of Afghanistan, that how Afghanistan has gone through different empires and different occupations, right, from British, Russia, then USA, and further the influence of the other regional powers or the European powers in Afghanistan and their interest. And you talk about you made mention about different agendas of these regional powers, that they are no more serious about the stability in Afghanistan. But I must say here that everybody is concerned about stability in Afghanistan, because stable Afghanistan is in the interest of South Asia, not only in South Asia, but whole of Asia for that matter, because the strategic location of Afghanistan, you know, it connects with Central Asia and there with the Pakistan and others. And we are having a serious security implications if there is an instability over there. So I would welcome the questions the people can post in the chat box so I can read it out. In the meantime, I think there is no question right now. So I would like to invite the next speaker. So you people can put your questions. The speakers are there. They can respond later on. So I am going to invite the next speaker, Jugnu Ara. She is a research scholar in the Department of Gandhian and Peace Studies. Jugnu, over to you.
Yes, sir. I'm audible for everyone.
Yeah.
Yes. Good afternoon, everyone. A very warm welcome. A very warm welcome to all the academician, paper presenter, participant, and dear research scholars to join this session. And a very big thanks to Dr. Aslam Khan, the chairperson of this session, for giving me such a global platform to share my views. Now, let me introduce myself. My name is Jugnu Ara, research scholar in Gandhian and Peace Studies from Mahatma Gandhi Central University, Bihar. My topic is water disputes in South Asia, implications for peace and security. Water is a vital resource, not only a fount of life. It often helps to bring people together, but access to water is highly unequal between and within the countries. Much of the world's population lives in places where demands of water exceed supply or poor quality limits its use. Scarcity of water and inequalities are also risk factor for violent conflict. Water-related violence is already common in many parts of the world, is generally expected to increase in the years ahead. Disputes over water are central to the political economy of development in South Asia. This paper looks at the development in South Asia, the way that the allocation of water is mediated by different kinds of state society, relations in India, Bangladesh, Bhutan, China, Nepal, and Pakistan, by examining common property resources management issues from three different spatial and three different scales. The first one was international, second one was intranational, and the third one was international. By doing so, we can begin to appreciate the complexity of problems in the management of water likely trend throughout the region. We do this by examining the contestants. India-China water disputes. The Brahmaputra and the glaciers that feed Ganga originated in China as an upstream riverain region. China originated upstream region maintains an advantageous position and can build infrastructure to intentionally prevent water from flowing downstream. Owing to previous tendencies where the Chinese have to been reluctant to provide details of its hydropower project, there is a trust deficit between the two neighbors. China's dam building and water division plans along the Brahmaputra is a source of tension between the two neighbors. Despite the two having signed several moves on strengthening communication and strategic trust. As lower riparian countries, India and Bangladesh rely on Brahmaputra's water for agriculture. China has now planned to build 4 more dams on the Brahmaputra in Tibet. Both India and Bangladesh worry that these dams will give Beijing the ability to divert or store water in the time of political crisis. India, for its part, has built dams on the Tista River, a tributary of the Brahmaputra, to utilize the flow of the Tista during the dry season. The need of the hour for the peace and security in relation with the water disputes was China, India, and Bangladesh should design a comprehensive river basin plan to control geological disaster and impact over the hydroelectric projects. The security forces of both countries should be deployed in the border areas for the early reporting of any serious ecological changes found in the region. India need to present the issue multilaterally by involving Bangladesh, not bilaterally. Promote win-win solution, propose joint hydroelectric dam project, India-Bangladesh water relation. India and Bangladesh sharing the waters of Tista River, which originate in the Himalayas and flows through Sikkim and West Bengal to merge with the Brahmaputra in Assam and Jamuna in Bangladesh, is perhaps the most continuous issues between the two friendly neighbors, India and Bangladesh. The river covers nearly the entire floodplains of Sikkim while draining 2,800 square kilometers of Bangladesh, governing the lives of hundreds of thousands of people. For West Bengal, Tista is equally important, consistently the lifeline of half dozen districts in North Bengal. Bangladesh has sought an equitable distribution of Tista waters from India on the lines of the Ganga Water Treaty of 1996, an agreement to share surface water at the Farakka barrage near the mutual border. India-Nepal water relation. Water cooperation between India and Nepal have been agreements signed on major rivers like Kosi, Gandaki, Karnali, or Mahakali, essentially for large hydroelectric and irrigation projects by buildings, dams, or barrages. No project except the Kosi barrage has been completed yet. Smaller rivers have also been ignorant. Since 1954, when the Kosi agreement was signed between India and Nepal, talks between the two governments has stalled and water rights issues have not been addressed. There have been various disputes over this agreement fueled by floods in the Kosi region. India and Nepal have also had disputes over the issue by compensation of the Kosi Dam. Moreover, Nepal had considered India's construction as an encroachment on Nepal's territorial sovereignty. Problem with the Kosi River is its high level sedimentation and embankments have proven to be ineffective to tackle the sedimentation. The only avoidable option in this case is storage tanks, and these can't be set up without the cooperation of Nepal. India and Nepal have traditionally disagreed over the interpretation of the Sagauli Treaty signed in 1816 between the British East India Company and Nepal, which delimited the boundary along the Mahakali River in Nepal. India and Nepal differ as to which stream constitutes the source of the river. The dispute between India and Nepal might seem minor, but it gains strategic importance because the disputed area lies near the Sino-Indian border. India-Pakistan water disputes. Both India and Pakistan since partition have experienced friction over water conflicts. The country's early leaders anticipated their fierce rivalry over the waters that connect their volatile borders. As a result, after numerous dialogues and through careful negotiations, both countries signed an accord called the Indus Water Treaty in 1960, which clearly determined how the region's rivers are to be divided. In this treaty, control over 3 eastern rivers of the Bias, India, through careful negotiation, both countries signed an accord called the Indus Water Treaty in 1960, which clearly determined how the region's rivers are to be divided. In this treaty, control over 3 eastern rivers of the Bias, Ravi, Satluj was given to India, which Pakistan got control over western rivers of the Indus, Chenab, and Jhelum. The Indus Water Treaty has been widely hailed as a success, having survived 3 post-independence war between the 2 hostile neighbors. However, the situation for Pakistan has changed significantly from 1960s till the present moment, as it now on the brink of water scarcity. The source or flow of all the Pakistan rivers pass through the India first, so this naturally provides India with the upper hand in controlling the overflow of these rivers. The Indian government has more than 40 projects that are either already completed or in the proposal states on the western rivers. The carrying of such activities within the western rivers has irked Pakistan. In 2005, Pakistan challenged India's 450 megawatt Bagilihar Dam project on the Chenab River before the World Bank, but lost the case in the end. In 2011, both countries at the International Court of Arbitration over India's 330 megawatt project in Kishanganga projects in Jammu and Kashmir. The latest disputes is over a hydroelectric project that India is building along the Chenab River. According to Pakistan, this project violate the treaty and will impact the water supply. India-Bhutan water relation. India and Bhutan Hydroelectric Power Corporation started more than 5 decades ago. Initially, the cooperation was based on the development of small-scale hydro projects such as Tala, Chauka, and Kurichur. Bhutan has the potential to generate 30,000 megawatt of hydropower. In 2006, both countries inked a power purchase agreement of 35 years that would allow India to generate and import 5,000 megawatt of hydropower from Bhutan, the quantum of which increased to 10,000 in 2008. For instance, if Bhutan over decided to construct storage project, issues will get intense and more problematic when it comes to dealing with the India. The conclusion was that the water disputes in South Asia subcontinent deal with the complex orientation of the rivers of the region that cut across some countries in the region, complemented by a tense and uncompromising geopolitical situation amongst the fellow riparian countries, brings out the strategic role played by water in the region. What we have do for the working towards peace building process, the first was enhancing cooperation amongst the South Asian countries, cooperation, for instance, in managing the Gangas and Brahmaputra rivers through a new regulatory body. There is a need to fix a new regulatory body, also need for new water treaties covering domains such as flood control and irrigation department by organizing intersectorial dialogue and coordination between the agriculture, water and energy industries help to resolve water related conflicts. Need to more effectively implemented checks and balances so as to limit the decision-making power of any one countries. Water is an increasingly scarce resource, and the search for water, it will always be competitive. Countries must realize that everyone has the right to access fresh water, and no one has the right to deprive the others by doing so. Countries in South Asia need to place a greater emphasis on regional cooperation founded in international law in order to overcome water-related disputes. That's all. Thank you so much.
Congratulations, Jugnu, for the wonderful presentation that you spoke on the water security in South Asia, and you covered all aspects and all the dispute regarding the water and the water security. Then you mentioned about the international arrangements for that those dispute, and some of the treaties that are decades long are not well materialized until now, and there is still a problem of water security in South Asia that is affecting whole region. Then you talk about the Indo-China, you talk about the Indo-Bangladesh, Indo-Bhutan, Indo-Nepal, about various issues pertaining to water, like Kosi agreement with Nepal and all. So thank you very much for the wonderful presentations. Then I would request the audience, if you are having any question or concern or observation, yeah. Please write in the chat box so I can read it out. Please write in the chat box, whoever has any question or observation. The next speaker is Virendra Gandhi from Department of Gandhian and Peace Studies. Virendra, now over to you. Virendra, can you hear? Virendra? Virendra, unmute yourself. Hello.
Yes, sir.
Virendra, not you.
Hello.
Yes.
Am I?
You disconnect and connect again. Okay. Better you check your mics and all. Can you hear me? Okay, Virendra, you have to wait now, so I will invite.
Thank you, sir. Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Nice, for providing me an opportunity to. Yes, sir. I am hearing. Hello.
Go ahead.
Am I visible?
Yeah.
Yes.
Go ahead. I think he has some connection problem, so I would like to invite now Kushank. Kushank, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Kushank is also a research scholar in the Department of Gandhian and Peace Studies. Kushank, now over to you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. And a special thanks to Dr. Aslam Khan sir, who provide us this kind of opportunity. My name is Kushank Kumar. I am a research scholar from Mahatma Gandhi Central University, Bihar. I am going to speak to you about Buddhism perspective of peace and foreign policy. First, we have to understand Buddhism is a part of religious. It is a way of life. Sorry, I have some sore throat problem, so sorry for inconvenience. In the 21st century, it is established that the 488 million of people, approx to 9 to 10% of total population, practices Buddhism. The main countries that practices Buddhism is China, Japan, Korea, Vietnam, India, Sri Lanka, Thailand, Nepal. Buddhism has a long celebrated as a religious peace and non-violence, which is increasing the validity of regions around the world.
Hello. Hello. Hello.
So we think that the speaker has disconnected, I think.
Dr. Abhay Vikram Singh, I think he has entered in the. Dr. Abhay Vikram Singh, can you hear me? Dr. Abhay Vikram Singh? Dr. Abhay, Virendra, can you hear me?
Yes, I am listening you. Yes, sir.
Okay, Virendra, now you can continue your presentation. I think Kushank has lost his connection, so later on he will join us. Okay.
Yes,
Yeah,
sir. Thank you, sir.
I am in, Dr. Aslam Khan sir. Good afternoon.
Okay, thank you. Virendra, go
Thank you,
ahead.
sir. Yes, sir. Thank you, sir, for providing me an opportunity to.
We can't hear you now.
Share my views on India-Nepal relationship. Today's
My
topic is major
Yes,
irritant in Indo-Nepal relationship. Okay, now I am going to start that as a close neighbor, India and Nepal share a unique relationship of friendship and cooperation, characterized by open border and deep-rooted people-to-people connect and kinship and culture. There has been a long tradition of free. Hello, am I audible, sir?
You better close
Hello.
your video and talk on your audio.
Hello.
Close your video.
Hello. Am I audible, sir?
You are audible. Close your video and continue.
Hello. Hello. Sir, you was not coming here, sir.
Virendra, better you discontinue now. I can invite another speaker because there is a problem with your connectivity. Check your connectivity, then come back. Okay. Check your connectivity, then come back. I am inviting others because I don't want to get late for the session because these are other sessions after that. Okay. So Dr. Abhay Vikram Singh, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Please.
Am I audible, sir?
Dr. Abhay Vikram Singh, so I invite you for your presentation. It is now over to you.
Okay, thank you so much, sir. So, sir, as you know, there is a lot of problem regarding data. So it's better I off my video and then I present my.
Please go ahead.
Thank you so much. So good afternoon, everyone. I am Dr. Abhay Vikram Singh from Mahatma Gandhi Central University, Bihar. I am very thankful and it's my proud privilege to present my paper in the International Studies Convention 2021, organized by Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement. I'm also thankful to chairperson of this session, Dr. Aslam Khan, who gave me this huge opportunity. So as we all are aware that the theme of this three-day convention is reimagining the world, reflections on the future of world order. And I'm here to present my paper on the topic, dissecting peace in South Asia using Gandhian approach. Rather, my focus will be not only on South Asia, but also how Gandhian ideas are relevant and when we talk about world peace. Friends, Gandhi is a pioneer. He is a manual who is relevant irrespective of time and age. I can see that there are scholars and experts joining the different parts of the world, and I'm feeling fortunate that through this conference, I can put forth the ideas and core values of Gandhi and his philosophy, which implemented correctly can make a much better sustainable place to live in. And as today the world is sitting on the ball of fire, so facing dangerous, not from any outer or external force present in the universe, but from its own people, driven by greed, distrust, and disharmony. So when we talk about peace in Asia, we cannot ignore South Asia, South Asian countries. South Asia is very well defined geographically, historically, and geopolitically. We still don't realize how much potential and capabilities this part has, be it economic progress or the cultural enrichment of this area. But we see that it continues to have many unhappy distinctions. For example, mass poverty, ill health, technological underdevelopment, territorial disagreements between major states, and internal divisions as well, which threaten peace and harmony not only among the states, but affects the demography of whole Asia, and in turn also affects the whole world. So, dear friends, now we have to decide that what will be the worth of this peace. Do we believe that by strengthening UNO or by creating balance of power, everything will be solved? We all know that these are some approaches posed by international relations theorists. Do we think that disarmament is possible in today's scenario? So to answer this, we can see in international arena that no nation has 100% committed to it. So how to get out from this dilemma? Gandhi doesn't talk about these things as an expert of the subject matter, though he constructs a framework, a structure, and a system through his set of ideas and concepts, which aims to achieve world peace not only in idealistic way, but also in a realistic and pragmatic manner. Now I will present some of the Gandhian methods which I think work genuinely and in true sense towards attaining world peace. I strongly believe that these theories should not be narrowed down only to a classroom and a conference, but needs to be applied on a large level. Gandhiji once said that I respect the place which is inside you, where the whole world resides. He says that this place consists of light, love, truth, peace, and knowledge. He will respect that place which is in you, where people live with peace and have a feeling of brotherhood. For world peace, Gandhi specifically stresses on the foundations of universal brotherhood and the feeling of mutual cooperation. He states that we should fulfill our personal, domestic, and national responsibilities, but should not forget the responsibility of a basic human being. He says that the key solution to responsibilities and duties of the whole world lies in the protecting human life. This is the essence and fundamentals if we want to secure world peace. Gandhiji is known to be a representative of peace and non-violence. He says that untruth is the origin of violence. He emphasizes that to acquire truth, you need to walk on the road of non-violence, and also underlines the importance of satyagraha as a weapon for maintaining the world peace. To understand Gandhi's approach, we need to first and foremost understand the main crux of his social and political views. In this, Gandhi has indisputably propounded both sociology and epistemology. Gandhi has shown the world what power satyagraha and truth holds, and how through ahimsa, non-violence, we can make this world a better place. He first experimented this whole ideology in South Africa and then in India, and both the times it was beautifully successful. Let's talk about South Asia in this context. Each and every country talks about protecting humanity and establishing brotherhood among each other. But are we really able to do that? Are we successful in safeguarding the mankind? If you can say we have made so many treaties and settlement with each other, whether it's related to border and territorial issues or it's related to trade and business, but sometimes those targets are not even accomplished, and the tension and tussle grows among the countries. Here, Gandhi approach comes through. Gandhi says that everything which is being achieved among the nation in context of world peace is very shallow and just on surface level. Inside, everyone is jealous with each other. There is this fire burning inside each one, kindling with hatred and bitterness. Gandhiji says that if you want to achieve world peace, we first need to pour water and calm the feelings of resentment towards each other. We need to dive in deep and rigorously work to curb these emotions, and then only things which were at surface level will become comprehensive and all inclusive. Sarvodaya is a term meaning universal uplift or progress of all. The term was coined by Gandhi as the title of his 1908 translation of John Ruskin's tract on political economy unto this last. And Gandhi came to use the term for the ideal of his own political philosophy. Gandhi advances the concept of Sarvodaya, which will based on basic principle that the good of the individual is contained in the good of all. That a lawyer's work has the same value or same importance as the barber, in as much as all have the same right of earning their livelihood from their work. Sarvodaya reaffirms the concept of trusteeship. It means for working for economic equality and abolishing a room for conflict. The supreme test would be the material and moral growth of a human being, balanced one with other. Gandhi did not accept that the greatest good of the greatest number was a valid proposition, or that the ultimate good of mankind lay in the possession of more and more goods without a reference to moral values. Gandhi offered a pragmatic way to a social revolution, radical but through peaceful means, which guaranteed the improvement in the quality of life. In today's context, this age is still an age of conflicts, conflict within the nations, conflict between nations, between peoples. In South Asia, there are still problems of caste and economic class distinctions of the haves and have-nots, of the rights of religions and racial minorities. Now, according to Gandhi, we first need to solve the internal disputes and squabbles affecting a particular nation. Securing your territorial boundaries will get you nowhere if you are already on the brink of a civil war. If citizens of a particular nation are not happy and constantly revolting, then world peace or peace between the nations is pointless. Gandhi says that until and unless your nation as a whole is fully secured and unified on a grassroots level, running towards world peace is irrelevant and unproductive.
Easy, ma'am.
So this entire, idea of Sarvodaya of Gandhi can be concluded in one auspicious Sanskrit mantra, that is Loka Samastaha Sukhino Bhavantu, which conveys that let the entire world be happy. So, friends, Mahatma Gandhi believed that Satyagraha was the most powerful weapon in a non-violent struggle. It involves the willful, peaceful breaking of laws that are unjust. It means protecting and challenging the wrongs. For him, truth was God. Truth is not your or mine. It is not Western or Eastern. There are many countries which have witnessed popular movements for freedom, equality, and peace, which drew inspiration from the life and methods of Gandhi. In today's scenario, Gandhi's concepts of forgiveness can be seen to be a central development in context of world peace. Forgiveness offers hope. If we see it has a healing quality, to it which helps nations and individuals from the feeling of revenge and hatred. So in a time of conflicts between nations based on caste, class, ethnicity, race, gender, religion, forgiveness may have extraordinary value as a daily ethic as well as a practical process. Gandhi believed that the supreme law that governs all living things is nothing but love and non-violence. According to Gandhi, Satyagraha can be adopted by anybody. Gandhi said that Satyagraha was like a banyan tree which had innumerable branches. Gandhi says about Satyagraha, quote, "It is opposed to sin, not sinner, the evil, not evildoer," in quote. Gandhi here tries to emphasize that we need to eradicate the sin and evil from the minds of people, from the machinery and administration, machinery of administration, from the body of governments, rather eliminating the one who is practicing it. In that way, we can see that Gandhi will not oppose what Taliban is doing and what Afghani citizens are facing, but he will strongly oppose terrorism and fanaticism which is existing. He will not side either with India or Pakistan when it came to territorial disputes, but he will firmly disagree and oppose the feeling of hatred and bitterness created by the both sides. Gandhi stresses on that nationalism and internationalism are no different. According to him, both goes hand in hand. A person who have nationalism in true sense embodied in then can only be one to protect humanity and mankind. Gandhi says that each nation should share their skills and technology with the neighboring states, because truly speaking, the boundaries that we have carved is not natural but a man-made thing. Gandhi further says that problems which we are facing should not be congested in terms like religion, ideological, racial, national or international. A problem is simply a problem which has grappled the whole humanity and not only a group of people. Gandhiji says that trade and commerce we do between nations is baseless when we are having other disputes with each other, because only our self-interest and personal agenda should not be the ultimate goal. To conclude everything, Gandhiji says, quote, "If we have no charity and no tolerance, we shall never settle our differences amicably and must therefore always submit to the arbitration of a third party," end quote. World peace can never be achieved by one-dimensional and unilateral talks or efforts. It has numerous aspects of life, social, ethical, religious, and political elements, and there are abundant ways to deal with them and to bring worsened situations under control. Gandhiji says, quote, "Indeed, a civilian resistor offers resistance only when peace becomes impossible," end quote. These words are true even today, and they unfold into a very broader perspective. A civilian government fighting with its own citizens, or a highly civilized, democratized nation fighting, cross-border conflicts with its neighbors. So hence, peace becomes life for everyone and everything in the world. The rationale behind achieving peace is in the positive understanding of give and take, humanity, forgiveness, and non-violence. So this is the end of my paper. I am again very thankful to Dr. Aslam Khan, sir, and the NICE Nepal Institute. So over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Dr. Abhay Vikram Singh, for wonderful presentation. You very much highlighted the Gandhian values. Those are very much needed for the world peace. And you very much mentioned about the Sarvodaya and Satyagraha. To Satyagraha, these are a lot of foreign admirers and the writers, those talk about the Gandhian Satyagraha. Then they said the Satyagraha is meant to overcome all methods of violence. So the basic meaning of Satyagraha is to come out from all the methods of violence that we are facing in the contemporary society or in South Asia, not only in South Asia, whole world. We are having the vested interest of the countries, superpowers, regional powers, and the people living in those particular states, those are some political interest, their ideological conflict and all. So satyagraha is meant to overcome all methods of the violence. And Gandhi explained in a letter to Lord Hunter, I recall here, that satyagraha is a movement based entirely upon the truth, and it replaces every form of violence, direct and indirect, veiled and unveiled, and whether in thought, word, or deed. But when we apply Gandhi in a contemporary society, so my curiosity is that since we are talking of Gandhi, Gandhi has been the symbol of peace and is respected all over the world, and his methods of non-violence and all, these are being practiced when we are talking of the peace practitioners or the peace scholars. Then they regard Gandhi as a kind of prophet for that matter. But when we apply these concepts in our societies, in our region, when we are talking of our country, when we are talking of South Asia, then I feel some kind of, that disagreement within the governance, within the people, to accept Gandhi as a whole, because Gandhian idea is much of moral than people are very much practical in a present time. There is a Hobbesian state of nature, and I would say they are more than Hobbes, they are more than Machiavelli. In these varying conditions, when nation states are like Hobbesian state of nature or Machiavellian discourse, then how we can bring this kind of the comprehensive idea of satyagraha, truth and non-violence and all to our society and to the society of South Asia. So I would like to know something about it, if you can shed some light. Dr. Abhay Vikram. Dr. Abhay Vikram, can you hear me? Dr. Abhay? Am I audible?
Yes, sir, you are.
Yeah. Dr. Abhay, can you hear me? Okay, I think there is a problem of connectivity. So I would not waste much time. Whenever he will connect, then I will let him in and I will go for that interaction. So next speaker, I would like to invite Ghazala Tabassum. She is also a research scholar in the Department of Gandhian and Peace Studies. Ghazala, are you there? Ghazala?
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you. Such as very large platform, nice. Myself, Dr. Bascom from India. My presentation topic is refugee problem in South Asia, critical analysis. Refugee problem is not a new recent one. They are sorely harassed by the operation for the sake of religious, race, nationality, politics, and membership in various social organizations. They are forced to leave organization. They are forced their original residents to seek safety in other countries. They are not able to seek advantage of security in their own country because of the fear of violence. Problems faced by refugee at different dimensions. Persecution. There are various types of persecution which lead to a refugee crisis. These include racial, social, political, and religious persecution. Climate, it is major factor for refugee crisis. It is an urgent and growing threat to security, contributing increased natural disaster, refugee flow, and conflict over basic resources as like food, water, financial hardship. The refugees are more likely to be poor due to the health, local unemployment rate. Thus, we can include the most vulnerable fact about refugees are that they live in extreme poverty. Refugee can become a threat to a country in many ways, such as threat to governance of security risk, threat to cultural identity, and as a social economic burden. As can be seen, Rohingya fulfill all these criteria. They have been denied citizenship by Myanmar. They are persecuted by minority religious and ethnic group. They are seen as the world's most oppressed caste Muslim community. Although objects labeled on humanitarian grounds, its implications further point to the insecurity of the local people due to the influence of foreign people. The discussion on different refugee groups hosted by South Asian countries deals with the condition of South Asia by highlighting two countries, India and Bangladesh. India has solid reason for not accepting them. These are creating peace and security in India. The past experience are not favorable for India. For this reason, India treats these refugees with suspicion. India's peace and security are under threat because of Rohingya, its refugees. According to the Ministry of Home Affairs, there are 40,000 refugees living in India illegally. It is a matter of concern that many such refugees are included in these who are keeping links with many terrorist organizations. Therefore, it is necessary for the peace and security of India that these refugees should return their own residence. However, it is not that India has never accepting refugees from Myanmar in 1980s and 1990s, but the current situation is different, and it cannot be said whether it would be appropriate to give refugees to these refugees because it may destroy India peace and security. Therefore, India should take some concrete steps for this. India consider all Rohingya refugees illegal immigrants, and it is looking for an effective repatriation agreement to deport them back to their countries of origin. Currently, the refugee crisis in South Asia is increasing. In such situation of India supports of Rohingya, then the pressure will increase into giving security to the Tamil Madhya people as well. In this situation, the national interest of India will be affected. India is conscious of its internal security. India has suffered a large number of refugees from Assam, the problem they created. There is different and bigger dimension to the security relationship in the contents of Rohingya. Due to its crisis, interests of the three countries are being affected, and it's necessary that India would take concrete step on the extradition of the Rohingya in order to not allow tension in bilateral relations. Bangladesh, more than 10,000 refugees have fled to Bangladesh in last few days to escape the escalating violence. Those who managed to escape have exposed themselves to problems of violence, rape and arson. Now it's not appropriate to give shelter to such a large number of refugees. For this, Myanmar should take decisive steps as soon as possible. Child protection is a very important issue at present, as many children are missing or displaced. They also faces the risk of becoming ill from malnutrition, trafficking, and other diseases. That makes Rohingya refugees among the world's most vulnerable and the people fleeing their homes since the ongoing uncertainty over the threat of storms and disease outbreaks. Living together in partnership with the Bangladesh government and the United Nations Agency, it is caring up to 6,500 Rohingya refugees with life-saving assistance and helping to improve living conditions in Rohingya camps. Despite the help, Rohingya people remain to rest and their future is certain. The United Nations High Commission said about the Rohingya in Bangladesh, the Muslim exodus are the worst king of emergency in the world. There is currently a need for a long-term solution, not helping Rohingya to ease their current suffering. Myanmar must end the violence that has caused too many problems to flee their homes. That's all. Thank you.
Very good, Ghazala, for your presentation on refugee problem in South Asia. So when you are talking of the refugee problem and you are presenting here, you must also give a general account of refugees in South Asia, since we are having a refugee problem now currently from Afghanistan and all. So this is also affecting the security of South Asia. So you made mention about the Rohingya refugees. And in terms of the Rohingyas, these were some UN assist observations and reports that Rohingya, they were having some kind of the genocidal behavior by the government of Myanmar earlier, but these are a lot of issues that a lot of Rohingyas, they have flown to Bangladesh, and the Cox's Bazar is the biggest camp for the Rohingyas then in India. And both of the premiers of Bangladesh and India, they have declared the presence of Rohingya as a threat to the national security. So it is a very, that very heavy statement, a threat to national security, that some of the Rohingyas were also found in Jammu and Kashmir recently. So you made mention about only for Rohingyas, but in general, you are talking about the refugee problem in South Asia. So you need to make a very comprehensive study in terms of the refugees in South Asia. You are just pinpointing on one particular area, and you presented your paper in the with a special reference to Rohingya. So Rohingya is a very serious problem, very a security threat to the nations, and a humanitarian crisis also. So it was a very good presentation by you, and you need to make some more improvements, since you people are not very much exposed for those kind of the international events. So you people are getting opportunity, and I'm highly thankful to NIS and especially Dr. Pramod Jaiswal, who gave you people the opportunity to speak in such forum where all the leading international speakers are part of it, leading scholars, leading political scientists. So you must have a kind of thanks, and you should offer a thanks to NICE for this wonderful opportunity. So next speaker, now I would like to invite Virendra. Now your connection is okay. Please check, unmute yourself, Virendra.
Yes, sir.
You can hear me?
Am I audible, sir?
Yeah.
Yes, sir. I'm listening. Thank you, sir.
Speak without your video. I would like to request that you just stop your video, because I know in Motihari too much rain is there, some connection problems. I am hearing some phone calls that these are some serious network problems. So just off your video and continue.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you once again. Myself, Virendra Gandhi, and I am pursuing PhD from Gandhi and Peace Department, Motihari. And today's my topic is major irritant in Indo-Nepal relations. Now I am going to start my presentation. As a close neighbor, India and Nepal share a unique relationship of friendship and cooperation, characterized by open border and deep-rooted people-to-people connect of friendship and culture. There has been long tradition of free movement to people, movement of people cross the border. Nepal has an area of more than 14 square kilometer and population of 29 million. It's a border over the 15 50 kilometers east, south and west with 5 states of India, Sikkim, West Bengal, Bihar, Uttar Pradesh and Uttarakhand, and in the north with the People's Republic of China. The foundation of relationship between India and Nepal was lead to with Indo-Nepalese Friendship Treaty in 1950. In the 1950s, the Rana rulers of Nepal welcomed close relations with the newly independent India, fearing China backed the communist overthrow of their Rana autocratic regime. Rana rules in Nepal, however, collapsed within 3 months of the Indo-Nepal Treaty of Peace and Friendship. Rana stated that neither government shall tolerate any threat to the security of other by foreign aggressor and obligated both sides to inform each other of any serious misunderstanding with any neighboring state likely to cause any breach in the friendly relations, subsiding these across these records recorded cemented a special relationship between India and Nepal. Treaty of Peace and Friendship between Government of India and Government of Nepal is bilateral treaty between Nepal and India, establishing a close strategic relationship between the two South Asian neighbors. The treaty was signed at Kathmandu on 21 July 1950 by the last Rana and Indian ambassador to Nepal, Chandreshwar Narayan Singh. Rana ruled in Nepal ended just 3 months after the treaty was signed. The treaty allowed free movements of people and goods between the two nations and close relationship and collaboration on matter of defense and foreign policy. The treaty has allowed Nepal to overcome the disadvantages of being a landlocked country. Over the year, many regimes in Nepal had raised the issue on revision of the treaty. India maintained that it is willing to examine all bilateral arrangements with a view of further stronger over the relations. Specific suggestions from Nepali side have not been forthcoming. Indian firms are the biggest investors in Nepal, accounting for about 14% of total approved foreign direct investment till 15 July 2013. The government of Nepal has approved total more than 2,600 foreign investment projects. There are about 150 operating Indian ventures in Nepal. They are engaged in manufacturing, service, banking, insurance, transport, education, and telecom, power sector, and tourism industries also. Security cooperation and boundary management security-related issues are of prime concern to both countries to deal jointly with each other's security concern. The two countries have institutionalized home secretary level meeting and established joint working group on border management, water resources, construction, embankment, power exchange and trade, cultural relations. TB Kurala India Nepal Relation Foundation, Indian Culture Center, Kathmandu, Nepal, Bharat Library, its program are working in bilateral relations between India and Nepal. Challenges between India and Nepal relationship. Madhesi movement is prominent in the contemporary dispute. This is affected the India-Nepal relationship. As one of the reasons of this is the belief of Nepal government that India has interfering in domestic politics of Nepal. China has also been observed provoking Nepal against India. Today the situation in Nepal has changed drastically. This has made a deep impact on relationship of India and Nepal. John Galtung has proposed the true nature of peace positive peace and negative peace. Negative peace is the pervasive between India and Nepal through there is no situation to a direct war or violence, but there has also a mental estrangement. Today, where at one hand distrust against India is rising in Nepal, on the other hand, Madhesi ethnic conflict is growing in the rest, and reason for this is the probably to clones with India. The Deputy Prime Minister of Nepal has openly alleged India that it wants to detach Madhesi from Nepal to include in it. Indian government refuted this statement made some day ago and asked the Nepal government to stop making anti-Indian statements. China's closeness with Nepal. China's closeness with Nepal and the influence of China in India and Nepal relationship is the cause of concern. Nepal is landlocked state that has relied much on India for major supplies, transit, and transport. India-Nepal blocked changed the perception of completely. The Nepal earthquake in 215 was a perfect time for China to make massive investment and infrastructure like Tibet Railways, many highway projects, access to Chinese port act. In the end of 2016, China became a major assistance provider of Nepal. Ideal cooperation, fuel, humanitarian assistance from China has increased many folds. For example, China pleased to provide 1.4 million liter fuel and planned to construct 715 MW West Seti Dham project. Nepal also supports China's built the road initiative, and the China-Nepal relation is so far stable to some extent. Border issue. Protected border disputes have routinely crowded bilateral relations between India and Nepal. The two countries share approximately 1,800 kilometer international open border with the managed under the bilateral Treaty of Peace and Friendship 1950. The border had been agreed upon in the 1816 Treaty of Sugauli, which stated in Article 5 that Nepal renounced for himself, his heir and successor all claim or to our connections with the countries lying to west of the river Kali. This means Kalapani to Limpiadhura stretch east of Kali river historically belonged to Nepal. However, India has deliberately misinterpreted the reasons of the Kali rivers to claim Nepal's land in Kalapani Limpapua region, including the Lipu Lake region. To resolve the dispute, Nepal and India formed a joint technical committee in 1981, which was successful in resolving 97% of border issue. The remaining 3% of approximately 606 square kilometer of dispute area is the crux of the protected border dispute. The border tension re-scaled on 8 May 2020 when Indian Defence Minister Rajnath Singh inaugurated the 80 kilometers long road of Mansarovar, a part of which the built on Nepal's land in Alipu Lake area. Challenges of reaching the open border. Being provided the special status to Nepal, India in internal security faced many challenges such as the Pakistan militants using Nepali territory as a hideout, the base of infiltration into India. The Ministry of Home Affairs in its annual report 2000 highlighted this Pakistani involvement in Nepal and its security implications in India. The Nepalese Maoists have extended support and cooperation to Indian Maoists and carving out the compact revolutionary zone, a revolutionary corridor spreading from Nepal through Bihar up to Andhra Pradesh. Apart from these, the open border have also created challenges such as pumping fake Indian currency notes, human trafficking, especially young girls, and women's cattle smuggling, etc. Thank you. And I want to tell the solution. Firstly, focus-based approach is necessary not only India Nepal relations but also for other countries in the regions by the giving the more focus towards neighborhood first policy should be in South Asia. Thank you, sir. Thank you all of you. All of you. Thank you.
Virendra, for your presentation. Please mute yourself. Thank you, Virendra, for your presentation. You make mention on different issues in Indo-Nepal relations, since your topic was the major irritants in Indo-Nepal relations. So if we see the situation in South Asia and with the situation of neighborhood vis-a-vis India, then despite we are having a friendship treaty, Nepali citizens are having same right as the Indians, and they are having access and same treaty they are having with China. But when you are talking of the major irritants, some border issues are there. You make highlight of that. Some ethnic issues are there. But the data you provided is not updated, because you talk about the data of 2013. So a lot of positive developments have been happened. A lot of diplomatic channels has been opened for resolving those issues. Though the issues are still persisting, but as a scholar, as a research scholar, you need to focus more. And what kind of the theoretical discourse you are taking in your research, what kind of the things that you are mentioning. You are just mentioning a topic like an expert here, since you are in the earlier stage of your research. So you need to make what kind of the theoretical discourse is there, what kind of the conceptual framework you are taking for that matter. So you tried your best, but you need to improve further whenever you are going to present in such forums. So I'm not discouraging you, but you need to learn a lot of things from this, that how to appeal up a very good audience, that they are going to listen you on a very important, a very critical issue, the major irritant in Indo-Nepal relations. It is a very broad kind of, that analysis that it has in it. Okay, very broad elements this analysis has. So thank you very much for your presentation. Now I would like to invite Rishabh Dev Shukla for the presentation. He is also the research scholar in the Department of Gandhian and Peace Studies. Rishabh, it is over to you now.
Good afternoon.
Yes, you are audible. Go ahead.
Yes, sir. Good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome to all the academicians, paper presenters, and participants joining the session through the virtual platform. At the outset, I would like to show my gratitude towards Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement, respected Dr. Pramod sir, and Dr. Aslam Khan sir, the chairperson of the session, for giving me this opportunity to interact with a wonderful transnational gathering and translation gathering, and with a wonderful translation gathering, and allow me to share my views. I am Rishabh Shukla, a research scholar in the Gandhian and Peace Studies Department from Mahatma Gandhi Central University, Bihar, India. I am here to present my paper entitled External Intervention in South Asia, Threat to Peace and Security. As well as we all know, we are living in an era wherein two quarterly phenomena are unfolding side by side, globalization and regionalization. But both the factors have been under shadow of the systemic factors. According to Kenneth Wald, systemic factors matter most in shaping a nation-state behavior. Systemic factors can further be broadly divided into two parts, global and regional. For India and other countries of South Asia, analyzing the impact of global systemic factors in general and major power intervention in the region, particular is pertinent for the devising appropriate foreign policy instruments. According to Kautilya, in Arthashastra, the conqueror shall think of the circle of state as will, himself at the hub, and his allies drawn to him by the spokes through separated by intervening territory. Obviously, a nation state should think to most proximate part of the circle in more elaborate way. Hence, South Asia should be understood from this perspective by each and every nation state of the region. The geopolitical theory that highlights silence of South Asia in best way in the Rimland theory of Spikeman, South Asia is one of the essential part of the Rimland. Internally speaking, the South Asia is the one of the most significant regions in the world having internal homogeneity on the basis of geographical, climatic, economical, historical, and cultural basis, but badly lacks tendency of regionalism, and the most significant factor has been intervention of extra-regional power during the phase of Pax Britannica. It has been under the influence of Britain. During the Cold War, the region was under shadow of superpowers USSR and USA. In the 21st century, however, China has been the most significant, powerful extra-regional power, distributing internal cohesion and unity. China factoring the biggest threat in this area. Pakistan has a gateway for the external institutions. It has started entering to the region by colluding with Pakistan and capturing India's land and threatening India's territorial integrity and sovereignty. Aksai Chin, CPEC, and recent exclusion along the LOC have been some of the examples. Second, China has been threatening to region as satellite for China's lesser developed hinterland regions like Tibet. The proposed BIC, Bangladesh India China corridor, is an example. Capturing geostrategical ports in the region of establishing hegemony in water bodies around the Indian Ocean, Hambantota, Sri Lanka, Java are important for OBOR initiative and its ambitions in the Indo-Pacific. This is the reason with which China has not resolved its boundaries disputes Bhutan, India. Illegitimate institutions in the region, according to WAN News, many unauthorized structures are made in Nepal. Economical dependency through trade and investment and peaceful rise, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and even India. Next, USA dubious role. Recent sequence of events in Afghanistan is testimony of fact. It has always been guided by its own narrowly defined national interest. It has opened a door for external intervention in the region. China and Russia are the major funders. And next regional solidarity is the solution. None of the countries from South Asia, including India, would like to have ensure an unstable region. Hence, all the countries, including India, should think to come together. And also, Pakistan should not be guided by its anti-India feeling because it gives opportunity to extra regional powers to unnecessarily intrude in the region. Thank you.
Thank you, Rishabh, for your presentation. Since you were talking on very important title, the external intervention in South Asia. So when you were talking of the history of external intervention in South Asia, when we go back to the history of external intervention of South Asia, then we see that a lot of colonial powers have been there since long time, and you can see the British colonialism. Then after that, then in the Cold War period, you can see then invasion of Afghanistan by USSR and all. Then after 9/11 USA. So now since external intervention, when we see the regional issues in South Asia, then we see the reflections and footprints of the external intervention in South Asia. But the thing is that all the regional mechanisms made for the peace, prosperity in South Asia that has been already collapsed or the verge of collapse. We can take the example of SARC, for instance. Then SARC was not successful because of the internal kind of differences or enigmatic behavior between the state, because religion plays a very dominant role in South Asian politics, and the states were divided on the basis of the religion. They cannot cooperate with each other because of their security. Pakistan is always having the leverage of having the Western support. And on the other hand, now China-Pakistan alliance and all that says a different story. So external intervention is a very important component. And whenever you are going to present on these serious issues or serious topics, then you need to have all backgrounds of these issues, what kind of that intervention is there, what are the interests of the superpowers in the region, and what are the interests of the countries of the region. Because Pakistan is having the issue of survival against the India, because both the countries are having nuclear power, and both nuclear states. And now recently US senators asked President Biden that what kind of the arrangement or the plan you are making that Afghanistani Taliban or the radical groups are not going to have the control on the nuclear armaments. So these are some of the latest issues that these are the burning issues in terms of Afghanistan. Though you talk about the dual nature or of US foreign policy here, but it's not dual, because US foreign policy is very much clear. There is no permanent friend, there is no permanent enemy, only the interest is permanent. So the nations or the superpowers, they work according to their interest. So now the Afghanistan region is open. Afghanistan is open, South Asian region open, and the nation of the South Asia, they are having a different kind of threats in terms of that security threats, the threat for peace, the threat for development, because automatically when there is no peace, then the development prospect will hamper. So a lot of issues are there, and it is a very hot topic for the research. It has always been this Pakistan-Afghanistan region, but the new kind of the things, because we are seeing the presence of neo-Taliban, because those Talibans earlier, now they are reflecting the new Taliban, they are somehow different, they are going to respect individual dignity and all. But the reports from the grounds are also not welcoming. But on the other hand, the official statements by Taliban leaders or the Taliban spokespersons are very much, that a neo kind of approach that they want to take each and everybody in confidence. They want inclusive governance and all. So this is the one issue. And the other issues that because Pakistan's close alliance with Taliban is always a growing concern or already concern for India, that how they are going to tackle these security issues, because in Kashmir and all, we are recently there was a news that Masood Azhar has met Taliban to help to seek the security, to seek the help in Kashmir. So a lot of issues are there. But when we see the media management is also playing a very prominent role, because in Indian media that we are seeing a lot of anti-Taliban always. When you will switch on your television set, then you will see some kind of the analysis over there by the news anchors or the experts, but officially India is dealing very carefully with Taliban's. They are having back channel diplomacy and all the nations, because sooner or later the kind of the indications they are giving that Talibani regimes or the new regime in Afghanistan, they are going to be accepted by the regional powers like China, Russia, and all. So this will be a very interesting development to watch and for research. So thank you very much for the wonderful presentation, Rishabh. And since we are still time left, if somebody is having any question or observation, they can make, or other speakers who have spoken earlier, if they want to make some kind of addition or some kind of the observation, they are also welcome. So if anybody they want to make any mention, they can. They are most welcome. If not, then I will continue for a while. So if we keep a picture of South Asia, so some important questions concerning the conflict in South Asia, those are having the external intervention. That the questions are, what is the nature of contemporary conflict in South Asian region? They are ethnic, they are identity conflict, they are resource-based conflict. And what are the major traditional and non-traditional sources of threat to regional peace and security? And the next question emerges that how can the individual state governments tackle the conflict at the incipient stage before they turn violent? And the next is how could the state governments put a consensus in defining a regional framework of preventing conflicts and escalating into deadly violence or any untoward situation. So what are the next question is common regional problems that are of concerns for the member state. So when if we talk one by one, the contemporary conflict, I should also mention here the nuclear armed history of India and Pakistan, because on most of the occasions there were exchange of threats of use of nuclear weapons, or the first use of nuclear policy, or the second use of nuclear policy. So this is also one of the, it is, you know, like South Asian region particularly now is in a very critical situation, because there is no regional framework, there is no regional understanding within the states to tackle those particular threats. And the interest of the other regional powers or the external regional powers or the superpowers is increasing. Withdrawal of the US from from Afghanistan is not like that. They are not going to have their influence in Afghanistan. So since there was a kind of the swift deal of power sharing, because the way the Taliban came into Afghanistan and installed their government over there, or they took control of the power, because they are still in the formation of the government formally. So it raises so much questions and concerns before the scholars of the IR or the scholars of the peace and security studies, that how swift transformation that the former regime has left without having any kind of, you know, that resistance and all. And the withdrawal, the US withdrawal from the Afghanistan, then the China Taliban this collaboration, or the China Taliban talks, and then Russia's interest also. So a lot of things are there, because now there has been a center of superpower rivalry in Afghanistan, because the China now claiming to come at par with the United States in terms of the security issues, because China is also taking as an opportunity, because it's India's engagement with the Western Bloc in terms of the Quad and all. So these are a lot of factors are there. Iran is also catching this opportunity to have a good relationship with the Taliban, but the situation is very complex, because the kind of the nature of those forces coming up for the power sharing, there may be disagreement, or there will be disagreement in the future if they install the government because when the question will come to the power or the handling of the state affairs, then there might be difference. And this Northern Alliance and the other groups, they might come into the conflict with others, because now we are seeing a different kind of the things, because now Taliban want to establish a government and that can be legitimized, and the other states, they should recognize the neo-Taliban regime for that matter. So after that, the issues of the foreign policy, the issue of the domestic issues, they will arise. And the issues, because Pakistan is having a close alliance with Taliban, and they are having a very prominent role with this US Taliban peace deal. So these countries are also having their own stakes, their own interest. So the security situation in South Asia is on a danger note. And on the other hand, there is no regional mechanism to solve those particular crises, because an unstable South Asia is not in the interest either of the power, not in the interest of China, not even in the interest of India or other nations of the region. So this is the present scenario of the Afghanistan, and the questions I already raised, that these kind of the questions, that what kind of the what are the common regional problems that the nations, the one common platform of SAARC is disabled now, and there is no such talks on that forum, that what should be the situation in terms of the dealing with Taliban or the any kind of the untoward incident. So this is a very unfortunate kind of the situation in South Asia, and I hope that you people will have more deliberations, more studies on it. And since a lot of scholars, lot of political scientists, international scholars, they are having their own interpretations of the things or the events. So it will be very interesting for the near future. So thank you very much to all of you to join this wonderful session of peace and security in South Asia. And if anybody, I think nobody is left for presentation, everybody has presented, and one participant, he was disconnected earlier, he is not joined yet. So still we are having 5 minutes more, so that if anybody is having any kind of observation or any addition they want to make for a more knowledge in terms of this focus of this area, so they can make their mention. Thank you very much. So anybody who want to make some mention or any observation?
Hello.
Yes, please.
Sir, I want to ask, what will be role of European Union in Nepal peace, in Nepal Afghanistan matter? What will be role of European Union?
Actually, European Union, you should not ask European Union. Your question should be focused on the NATO.
Yes,
of European Union, okay? Because NATO's role has been very constructive in the alliance of the United States and Afghanistan, because the NATO's composition was for the security of the Europe, for the European security, but NATO extended their operations beyond that, and they entered in Afghanistan with alliance of United States of America. And now, since Trump took over the affairs of United States, there was a threat to the European security or to the NATO, because there was some serious disagreement within the NATO state, and Trump frankly asked for the more, that kind of security guarantee, or some kind of, that they are spending so much manpower and all. They need a kind of more, that since when somebody is your security guarantor, then you have to make so many compromises, and so many threat perceptions were emerging from the Trump's statement to the NATO also. So NATO role was very constructive with the United States in Afghan conflict or this war and terror. Now, after the US withdrawal, there should be a kind of reshaping of their relationship with new regime in Afghanistan, or because now situation is changing, and in the change situation and same change circumstances, now President Biden is resetting the relationship, and he is trying to regain the confidence of the alliance. But now this kind of the withdrawal is having also some serious questions on that, and let the time decide that what kind of the relationship of the NATO state they are going to have in new regime in Afghanistan. That is my submission. So I think Nimesh, Babu, we are all with the session now. So it is now over to you. Thank you very much once again, NICE and Dr. Pramod Jaiswal, for this wonderful opportunity of collaboration with you. And I am highly delighted. And our research scholars, particularly, this session was not of experts. These were the research scholars. It's a new university, and 2019, we introduced this Department of Gandhian and Peace Studies there. And these are the new scholars that are having political or the political science or the history background. And they got a very nice opportunity and a very nice exposure of their life in this event. So since they were not expert to the area, so my apologies that if the expectations were like that, but they tried their best, and I hope that we will groom them for the next upcoming programs or the collaborations with you physically or this virtually. And thank you very much once again for the opportunity. My heartfelt thanks to you and the NICE.
Thank you so much, sir. We were having a conversation in the back end, me and Nimesh, and what we could actually realize was that you're a gem for your students. You're trying to groom them as much as you can, and that actually reminds us of our school and college days as well. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us, and we'll start with the word of thanks.
Distinguished Chair, speakers, ladies and gentlemen, as we have come to the end of this session, we would like to express a sincere gratitude and thanks to the Chair for agreeing to chair and moderate the session today. Our sincere thanks also goes to all the speakers for being a part of the event and delivering such comprehensive and convincing presentations. We would like to acknowledge our gratitude to our friends from the diplomatic community, experts, academia, media, and different organizations. Finally, we must also mention our deep sense of appreciation for the audience who participated in the webinar and those who are watching us live. Thank you for your valuable time and attention, and for making this session productive with your questions. Once again, we are truly honored to have you all with us today. Please do join us in the next session. Thank you so much.